It was von Bieler who had to take the initiative when Heinrici needed new clothes, and von Bieler dreaded these encounters, for he usually came out the loser. When von Bieler last ventured to bring up the subject, he adopted a cautious approach. Tentatively, he inquired of Heinrici, "Herr Generaloberst, shouldn't we perhaps try to find a moment to be measured for a new uniform?" Heinrici had looked at von Bieler over the top of his reading glasses and had asked mildly, "Do you really think so, Bieler?" For just a moment, von Bieler thought he had succeeded. Then the Giftswerg asked icily, "What for?" Von Bieler had not raised the question since. But if Heinrici did not look the part of a general, he acted like one. He was every inch the soldier, and to the troops he commanded, particularly after his stand at Moscow, he was a legendary one. In December 1941, Hitler's massive blitzkrieg offensive into Russia had finally ground to a frozen halt before the very approaches to Moscow. All along the German front, more than 1,250,000 lightly clad troops had been trapped by an early and bitter winter. As the Germans floundered through ice and snow, the Russian armies, whom Hitler and his experts had virtually written off, appeared as if from nowhere. In an all-out attack, the Soviets threw 100 divisions of winter-hardened soldiers against the invaders. The German armies were thrown back with staggering losses, and for a time it seemed as if the terrible retreat of Napoleon's armies in 1812 would be repeated, on an even greater and bloodier scale. The line had to be stabilized. Heinrici was given the toughest sector to hold. On January 26, 1942, he was placed in command of the remnants of the Fourth Army, which held the ground directly facing Moscow and was the kingpin of the German line. Any major withdrawal on its part would jeopardize the armies on either flank and might trigger a rout. Heinrici took over on a bitterly cold day. The temperature stood at -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Water froze inside the boilers of locomotives. Machine guns would not fire. Trenches and foxholes could not be dug because the ground was like iron. Heinrici's ill-equipped soldiers were fighting in waist-deep snow, with icicles hanging from their nostrils and eyelashes. "I was told to hold out until the big attack that this time would surely take Moscow," he later recalled. "Yet all around me my men were dying, not only from Russian bullets. Many of them froze to death." They held out for almost 10 weeks. Heinrici used every method available to him, orthodox and unorthodox. He exhorted his men, goaded them, promoted, dismissed, and again defied Hitler's long-standing and inflexible order, Stare Verteidigung, stand fast. That spring, it was estimated by the staff of the Fourth Army that during the long winter, the Giftswerg had at times been outnumbered by at least 12-1. Outside Moscow, Heinrici developed a technique for which he became famous. When he knew a Russian attack was imminent in a particular sector, he would order his troops to retreat the night before to new positions 1 or 2 miles back. The Russian artillery barrages would land on a deserted front line. As Heinrici put it was like hitting an empty bag. The Russian attack would lose its speed because my men, unharmed, would be ready. Then my troops on sectors that had not been attacked would close in and reoccupy the original front lines. The trick was to know when the Russians were preparing for an attack. From intelligence reports, patrols, the interrogation of prisoners, and an extraordinary sixth sense, Heinrici was able to pinpoint the time and place with almost mathematical precision. It was not always possible to employ these methods, and when he did, Heinrici had to use great caution. Hitler had imprisoned and even shot generals for defying his no-withdrawal order. "While we could hardly move a sentry from the window to the door without his permission," Heinrici was later to record, "some of us, where we could, found ways to evade his more suicidal orders." For obvious reasons, Heinrici had never been a favourite of Hitler or his court. His aristocratic and conservative military background demanded that he faithfully observe his oath of allegiance to Hitler, but the call of a higher dictatorship had always come first. Early in the war, Heinrici had fallen afoul of the Führer because of his religious views. The son of a Protestant minister, Heinrici read a Bible tract daily, attended services on Sundays, and insisted on church parades for his troops. These practices did not sit well with Hitler. Several broad hints were dropped to Heinrici that Hitler thought it unwise for a general to be seen publicly going to church. On his last trip to Germany, while on leave in the town of Münster, Westphalia, Heinrici was visited by a high-ranking Nazi Party official sent from Berlin specifically to talk with him. Heinrici, who had never been a member of the Nazi Party, was informed that the Führer considers your religious activities incompatible with the aims of National Socialism. Stonily, Heinrici listened to the warning. The following Sunday, he, his wife, son and daughter attended church as usual. Thereafter he was promoted slowly and reluctantly. Promotion might have been denied him entirely, except for his undeniably brilliant leadership and the fact that the various commanders under whom he served, particularly Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, kept insisting on his promotion. Late in 1943, Heinrici incurred the enmity of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, once again on religious grounds. Göring vehemently complained to Hitler that during the retreat of the Fourth Army in Russia, Heinrici had failed to carry out the Führer's scorched earth policy. Specifically, he charged that the general had deliberately defied the orders to burn and lay waste every habitable building in Smolensk. Among other buildings left standing had been the town's great cathedral. Heinrici explained solemnly that, had Smolensk been fired, I could not have withdrawn my forces through it. The answer failed to satisfy either Hitler or Göring, but there was just sufficient military logic in it to prevent a court-martial. Hitler, however, did not forget. Heinrici, a victim of poison gas in World War I, had suffered ever since from various stomach disorders. Some months after the incident with Göring, Hitler, citing these ailments, placed Heinrici on the non-active list because of ill health. He was retired to a convalescent home in Karlsbad, Czechoslovakia, and there, in Heinrici's words, they simply let me sit. A few weeks after his dismissal, the Russians for the first time broke through his old command, the Fourth Army. During the opening months of 1944, Heinrici remained in Karlsbad, a remote spectator to the apocalyptic events that were slowly bringing Hitler's empire down in ruins: the invasion of Normandy by the Western Allies in June, the Anglo-American advance up the boot of Italy and the capture of Rome, the abortive plot to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, the overwhelming offensives of the Russians as they drove across Eastern Europe. As the situation grew increasingly critical, Heinrici found his inaction unbearably frustrating. He might have had a command by entreating the Führer, but that he refused to do. At last, in the late summer of 1944, after 8 months of enforced retirement, Heinrici was ordered back to duty, this time to Hungary and command of the hard-pressed 1st Panzer and Hungarian First Armies. In Hungary, Heinrici resumed his old ways. At the height of the battle there, Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, Hitler's protégé and Heinrici's superior in Hungary, issued a directive that any soldier found behind the front without orders was to be executed immediately and his body exhibited as a warning. Heinrici, disgusted by the command, angrily retorted, "Such methods have never been used under my command, and never shall be." Although he was forced to retreat from northern Hungary into Czechoslovakia, he contested the ground so tenaciously that on March 3, 1945, he was informed that he had been decorated with the swords to the oak leaves of his Knight's Cross, a remarkable accomplishment for a man who was disliked so intensely by Hitler. And now, just 2 weeks later, he was rushing to Zossen with orders in his pocket to take over the command of Army Group Vistula. As he watched Reichsstrasse 96 rushing away beneath the wheels of his speeding Mercedes, Heinrici wondered where it would ultimately lead him. He remembered the reaction of his staff in Hungary when his appointment became known, and he was ordered to report to General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the General Staff of OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, the Army High Command. They were shocked. "Do you really want the job?" asked his Chief of Staff. To his worried subordinates, the outspoken Heinrici seemed headed for certain trouble. As the commander of the Oder Front, the last major line of defence between the Russians and Berlin, He would be constantly under the supervision of Hitler and the court jesters, as one of Heinrich's officers called them. Heinrich had never been a sycophant, had never learned to varnish the facts. How could he avoid clashing with the men around the Führer? And everyone knew what happened to those who disagreed with Hitler. As delicately as they could, officers close to Heinrich had suggested that he find some excuse to turn the command down, perhaps for health reasons. Surprised, Heinrich replied simply that he would follow his orders, just like Private Schultz or Schmidt. Now, as he approached the outskirts of Zossen, Heinrich could not help remembering that at his departure his staff had looked at him as though I was a lamb being led to the slaughter. Unser Giftswerg literally means our poison dwarf, and the term was often applied to Heinrich in this sense by those who disliked him. "General," he said, "I've been in the wilds of Hungary. I know almost nothing about Army Group Vistula, what it's composed of or what the situation is on the Oder." Guderian was equally blunt. Briskly he replied, "I should tell you, Heinrich, that Hitler didn't want to give you this command. He had somebody else in mind." Heinrich remained silent. Guderian continued, "I was responsible. I told Hitler that you were the one man needed. At first he wouldn't consider you at all. Finally I got him to agree." Guderian spoke in a businesslike, matter-of-fact fashion, but as he warmed to his subject, the tone of his voice changed. Even 20 years later, Heinrich would remember in detail the tirade that followed. "Himmler!" Guderian snapped. "That was the biggest problem. Getting rid of the man you're to replace. Himmler!" Abruptly he got up from his chair, walked around the desk and began pacing the room. Heinrich had only recently learned that Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler was commander of the Army Group Vistula. The news had so astonished him that at first he did not believe it. He knew of Himmler as a member of Hitler's inner cabinet, probably the most powerful man in Germany next to the Führer. He did not know that Himmler had any experience commanding troops in the field, let alone directing the activities of a group of armies. Bitterly, Guderian recounted how in January, as the Polish front began to collapse before the tidal wave of the Red Army, he had desperately urged the formation of Army Group Vistula. At that time, it was envisioned as a northern complex of armies holding a major defence line between the Oder and the Vistula, roughly from East Prussia to a point farther south where it would link with another army group. If the line held, it would prevent the Russian avalanche from driving directly into the very heart of Germany, through Lower Pomerania and Upper Silesia, then into Brandenburg, and finally Berlin. To command the group, Guderian had suggested Field Marshal Freiherr von Weichs. At the time, he was just the man for this situation, Guderian said. What happened? Hitler said von Weichs was too old. Jodl was present at the conference, and I expected him to support me. But he made some remark about von Weichs's religious feelings. That ended the matter. "Then," thundered Guderian, "whom did we get? Hitler appointed Himmler, of all people, Himmler!" Guderian had, in his own words, argued and pleaded against the appalling and preposterous appointment of this man who had no military knowledge. But Hitler remained adamant. Under Himmler, the front had all but collapsed. The Red Army had moved exactly as Guderian had predicted. Once the Russians were across the Vistula, part of their forces swung north and reached the Baltic at Danzig, cutting off and encircling some 20 to 25 divisions in East Prussia alone. The remaining Soviet armies sliced through Pomerania and Upper Silesia, reaching the Oder and Neisse rivers. Everywhere along the eastern front, the German line was overwhelmed. But no sector had collapsed so fast as Himmler's. His failure had opened the gates to the main drive across Germany and the link-up with the Western Allies. Above all, it had placed Berlin in jeopardy. Guderian told Heinrich that just 48 hours before, he had driven to the Army Group Vistula headquarters at Birkenhain, roughly 50 miles north of Berlin, to try to persuade Himmler to give up the command. There he was informed that Himmler was ill. He had finally located the SS commander 20 miles away, near the town of Laeken, cowering in a sanatorium with nothing more than a head cold. Guderian quickly saw that Himmler's illness could be used to advantage. He expressed sympathy with the Reichsführer and suggested that perhaps he had been overworking, that the number of posts he held would tax the strength of any man. Besides being the commander of Army Group Vistula, the ambitious Himmler was also Minister of the Interior, Chief of the Gestapo, the German police forces and security services, head of the SS, and commander of the training army. Why not relinquish one of these posts, Guderian suggested? Say, the Army Group Vistula? Himmler grasped at the proposal. It was all too true, he told Guderian. His many jobs did indeed call for enormous endurance. But, Himmler asked, how can I possibly suggest to the Führer that I give up Vistula? Guderian quickly told Himmler that, given the authorization, he would suggest it. Himmler quickly agreed. That night, added Guderian, Hitler relieved the overworked, overburdened Reichsführer, but only after a lot of grumbling and with obvious reluctance. Guderian paused, but only for a moment. His acrimonious recital of disaster had been punctuated by bursts of anger. Now he flared again. His voice, choking with rage, he said, "The mess we're in is fantastic. The way the war is being run is unbelievable. Unbelievable." Through the previous months, Guderian recalled, he had tried to get Hitler to understand that the real danger lay on the Eastern Front, and that drastic measures were necessary. He urged a series of strategic withdrawals from the Baltic states, particularly from Courland in Latvia, and from the Balkans, and even suggested abandoning Norway and Italy. Everywhere, lines needed shortening. Each division relieved could be sped to the Russian front. According to intelligence, the Russians had twice as many divisions as the Western Allies. Yet there were fewer German divisions fighting in the east than the west. Furthermore, the best German divisions were facing Eisenhower. But Hitler refused to go on the defensive. He would not believe the facts and figures that were placed before him. Then, Guderian declared, Hitler made possibly his greatest error. In December 1944, he unleashed his massive, last throw of the dice offensive against the Western Allies through the rolling forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and northern Luxembourg. The attack, Hitler boasted, would split the Allies and change the whole course of the war. Against the centre of the Allied line, he hurled 3 fully equipped armies, a total of 20 divisions, of which 12 were armoured. Their objective, to break through, reach the Meuse, and then swing north to capture the vital supply port of Antwerp. Caught off balance, the Allies reeled under the blow and fell back with heavy losses. But the offensive soon petered out. Swiftly recovering, Allied troops drove Hitler's shattered armies back behind Germany's borders in just 5 weeks. When it became obvious that the offensive had failed, Guderian said, I begged Hitler to get our troops out of the Ardennes and put them on the Eastern Front, where we expected the Russian offensive at any moment. It was no use. He refused to believe our estimates of their strength. On January 9th, Guderian told Hitler that the Russians could be expected to launch their attack from the Baltic to the Balkans, with a massive force totaling some 225 divisions and 22 armoured corps. The situation estimate had been prepared by General Reinhard Gehlen, Guderian's chief of intelligence. It indicated that the Russians would outnumber the Germans in infantry by 11-1, in armour by 7-1, and in both artillery and aircraft by at least 20-1. Hitler pounded the table and in a frenzy denounced the author of the report. "Who prepared this rubbish?" he roared. "Whoever he is, he should be committed to a lunatic asylum." 3 days later, the Russians attacked, and Gehlen was proved right. The front virtually collapsed, Guderian told Heinrici, simply because most of our panzer forces were tied down in the west. Finally, Hitler agreed to shift some of the armour, but he would not let me use the tanks to attack the Russian spearheads east of Berlin. Where did he send them? To Hungary, where they were thrown into a perfectly useless attack to recapture the oil fields. "Why, even now," he fumed, "there are 18 divisions sitting in Courland, tied down, doing nothing. They are needed here, not in the Baltic states. If we're going to survive, everything has got to be on the Oder front." Guderian paused, and with an effort calmed himself. Then he said, The Russians are looking down our throats. They've halted their offensive to reorganize and regroup. We estimate that you'll have 3 to 4 weeks, until the floods go down, to prepare. In that time, the Russians will try to establish new bridgeheads on the western bank and broaden those they already have. These have to be thrown back. No matter what happens elsewhere, the Russians must be stopped on the Oder. It's our only hope. In the west, Eisenhower's armies, as Heinrici had heard, were indeed on the Rhine, Germany's great natural defence line. The Anglo-American forces stretched for nearly 500 miles along the western bank, roughly from the North Sea to the Swiss border. At one point, the Rhine had even been breached. On March 7th, the Americans had seized a bridge at Remagen, south of Bonn, before it could be completely destroyed. Now a bridgehead 20 miles wide and 5 miles deep sprawled along the eastern bank. Other crossings were expected momentarily. In the east, the Soviets had swarmed across Eastern Europe and held a front of more than 800 miles, from the Baltic to the Adriatic. In Germany itself, they stood along the Oder-Neisse river lines, all the way to the Czechoslovakian border. Now, Guderian told Heinrici, they were feverishly preparing to resume their offensive. Reconnaissance planes had spotted reinforcements pouring toward the front. Every railhead was disgorging guns and equipment. Every road was clogged with tanks, motor and horse-drawn convoys, and marching troops. What the Red Army's strength might be at the time of attack, nobody could even estimate. But 3 army groups had been identified in Germany, concentrated for the most part directly opposite Army Group Vistula's positions. Looking at the front he had inherited, Heinrici saw for the first time what he would later describe as the whole shocking truth. On the map, the thin, wavering red line marking the Vistula's positions ran for 175 miles, from the Baltic coast to the juncture of the Oder and Neisse in Silesia, where it linked with the forces of Colonel General Schörner. Most of the front lay on the western bank of the Oder, but there were 3 major bridgeheads still on the eastern bank. In the north, Stettin, the 13th century capital of Pomerania. In the south, the town of Kustrin and the old university city of Frankfurt on Oder, both in the vital sector directly opposite Berlin. To prevent the Russians from capturing the capital and driving into the very heart of Germany, Heinrici discovered that he had only 2 armies. Holding the front's northern wing was the 3rd Panzer Army under the command of the diminutive General Hasso von Manteuffel, after Guderian and Rommel, probably the greatest panzer tactician in the Wehrmacht. He held positions extending about 95 miles, from north of Stettin to the juncture of the Hohenzollern Canal and the Oder, roughly 28 miles northeast of Berlin. Below that, to the confluence of the Neisse, 80 miles away, the defence was in the hands of the bespectacled 47-year-old General Theodor Busse and his 9th Army. Depressed as he was by the overall picture, Heinrici was not unduly surprised by the huge forces arrayed against him. On the eastern front, it was customary to fight without air cover, with a minimum of tanks, and while outnumbered by at least 9 or 10 to 1. But everything, Heinrici knew, depended on the calibre of the troops. What alarmed him now was the makeup of these 2 armies. To the experienced Heinrici, the name of a division and its commander usually served as an indication of its history and fighting abilities. Now, examining the map, he found that there were few regular divisions in the east that he even recognized. Instead of the usual identifying numbers, most of them had odd names such as Gruppe Kassen, Doberitz, Nederland, Kurmark, Berlin, and Muncherberg. Heinrici wondered about the composition of these units. Were they splinter troops, the remnants of divisions simply thrown together? Guderian's map did not give him a very clear picture. He would have to see for himself, but he had a dawning suspicion that these were divisions in name only. Heinrici did not comment on his suspicions, for Guderian had other, more immediate problems to discuss, in particular Kustrin. Heinrici's biggest army was Busse's 9th, the defence shield directly before Berlin. From the rash of red marks on the map, it was clear that Busse faced pressing problems. The Russians, Guderian said, were concentrating opposite the 9th Army. They were making a mighty effort to wipe out the 2 German-held bridgeheads on the eastern banks at Kustrin and in the area of Frankfurt. The situation at Kustrin was the more dangerous. In that sector during the preceding weeks, the Red Army had succeeded in crossing the Oder several times and gaining footholds on the western bank. Most of these attempts had been thrown back, but despite every defence effort, the Russians still held on around Kustrin. They had secured sizable bridgeheads on either side of the town. Between these pincer-like lodgements, a single corridor remained, linking the defenders of Kustrin with the Ninth Army. Once these pincers snapped shut, Kustrin would fall, and the linking of the two bridgeheads would provide the Russians with a major springboard on the western bank for their drive on Berlin. And now Guderian tossed Heinrici another bombshell. "Hitler," he said, "has decided to launch an attack to wipe out the bridgehead south of Kustrin, and General Busse has been preparing. I believe it's to take place within 48 hours." The plan, as Guderian outlined it, called for the attack to be launched from Frankfurt, 13 miles below Kustrin. 5 Panzer Grenadier divisions were to cross the river into the German bridgehead, and from there attack along the eastern bank and hit the Russian bridgehead south of Kustrin from the rear. Heinrici studied the map. Frankfurt on Oder straddles the river, with its greatest bulk on the western bank. A single bridge connects the two sections of the city. To the new commander of the Army Group Vistula, 2 facts were starkly clear. The hilly terrain on the eastern bank offered ideal conditions for Russian artillery. From the heights, they could stop the Germans dead in their tracks. But worse, the bridgehead across the river was too small for the assembly of 5 motorized divisions. For a long moment, Heinrici pored over the map. There was no doubt in his mind that the assembling German divisions would be instantly detected, and first pulverized by artillery, then hit by planes. Looking at Guderian, he said simply, "It's quite impossible." Guderian agreed. Angrily, he told Heinrici that the only way the divisions could assemble was to roll over the bridge one after the other, making a column of men and tanks about 15 miles long. But Hitler had insisted on the attack. "It will succeed," he had told Guderian, "because the Russians won't expect such a daring and unorthodox operation." Heinrici, still examining the map, saw that the sector between Kustrin and Frankfurt was jammed with Russian troops. Even if the attack could be launched from the bridgehead, the Russians were so strong that the German divisions would never reach Kustrin. Solemnly, Heinrici warned, "Our troops will be pinned with their backs to the Oder. It will be a disaster." Guderian made no comment. There was nothing to say. Suddenly he glanced at his watch and said irritably, "Oh God, I've got to get back to Berlin for the Führer's conference at 3. The mere thought of it set off another furious outburst. "It's impossible to work," Guderian spluttered. "Twice a day I stand for hours listening to that group around Hitler talking nonsense, discussing nothing. I can't get anything done. I spend all of my time either on the road or in Berlin listening to drivel." Guderian's rage was so violent that it alarmed Heinrici. The Chief of Staff's face had turned beet red, and for a moment Heinrici feared Guderian would drop dead on the spot from a heart attack. There was an anxious silence as Guderian fought for control. Then he said, "Hitler is going to discuss the Kustrin attack. Perhaps you'd better come with me." Heinrici declined. "If I'm supposed to launch this insane attack the day after tomorrow," he said, "I'd better get to my headquarters as soon as possible." Then stubbornly he added, "Hitler can wait a few days to see me." In the anteroom, Heinrich von Bieler was timing the meeting by the diminishing pile of maps and charts as they were taken into Guderian's office. There were only 1 or 2 left, so the briefing, he thought, must be almost over. He wandered over to the table and looked idly at the top map. It showed the whole of Germany, but the lines on it seemed somehow different. Von Bieler was about to turn away when something caught his eye. He looked closer. The map was different from all the others. It was the lettering that now caught his attention. It was in English. He bent down and began to study it carefully. It was almost 6 when the weary Heinrici reached his headquarters at Birkenhain, near Prenzlau. During the 2.5-hour drive from Zossen, he had remained silent. At one point, von Bieler tried to open a conversation by asking the general if he had seen the map. Von Bieler assumed that Guderian had shown a separate copy to Heinrici and explained its contents. Heinrici, in fact, knew nothing about it, and von Bieler got no answer. The general simply sat tight-lipped and worried. Von Bieler had never seen him so dejected. Heinrici's first glimpse of his new headquarters depressed him even more. The Army Group Vistula command post consisted of a large, imposing mansion flanked on either side by wooden barracks. The main building was an architectural monstrosity, a massive, ornate affair with a row of oversized columns along its front. Years before, Himmler had built the place as his own personal refuge. On a nearby siding stood his luxuriously appointed private train, the Steiermark. Like Zossen, this headquarters was hidden in the woods, but there the comparison ended. There was none of the military bustle Heinrici had come to expect of an active army group headquarters. Except for an SS corporal in the foyer of the main building, the place seemed deserted. The corporal asked their names, ushered them to a hard bench, and disappeared. Some minutes passed, then a tall, immaculately dressed SS Lieutenant General appeared. He introduced himself as Himmler's Chief of Staff, Heinz Lammerding, and smoothly explained that the Reichsführer was engaged in a most important discussion and could not be disturbed right now. Polite but cool, Lammerding did not invite Heinrici to wait in his office, nor did he make any of the usual gestures of hospitality. Turning on his heel, he left Heinrici and von Bieler to wait in the foyer. In all his years as a senior officer, Heinrici had never been treated in such a cavalier fashion. He waited patiently for 15 minutes, then spoke quietly to von Bieler. "Go tell that Lammerding," he said, "that I have no intention of sitting out here 1 minute longer. I demand to see Himmler immediately." Seconds later, Heinrici was escorted down a corridor and into Himmler's office. Himmler was standing by the side of his desk. He was of medium build, his torso longer than his legs, which one of Heinrici's staff remembers as being like the hind legs of a bull. He had a narrow face, a receding chin, squinting eyes behind plain wire spectacles, a small moustache and a thin mouth. His hands were small, soft, and effeminate, the fingers long. Heinrici noted the texture of his skin, which was pale, sagging, and somewhat spongy. Himmler came forward, exchanged greetings, and immediately launched into a long explanation. "You must understand," he said, taking Heinrici's arm, "that it is a most difficult decision for me to leave the Army Group Vistula." Still talking, he showed Heinrici to a chair. "But as you must know, I have so many posts, so much work to do, and also I'm not in very good health." Seating himself behind the desk, Himmler leaned back and said, "Now I'm going to tell you all that has happened. I've asked for all the maps, all the reports." 2 SS men came into the room. One was a stenographer, the other carried a large stack of maps. Behind them came 2 staff officers. Heinrici was happy to see that the officers wore Wehrmacht, not SS, uniforms. One of them was Lieutenant General Eberhard Kinzel, the Deputy Chief of Staff, the other Colonel Hans-Georg Eismann, the Chief of Operations. Heinrici was particularly glad to see Eismann, whom he knew as an exceptionally efficient staff officer. Lammerding was not present. Himmler waited until all had taken seats. Then he launched into a dramatic speech of personal justification. It seemed afterward to Heinrici that he began with Adam and Eve, and then went into such laborious explanatory details that nothing he said made sense. Both Kinzel and Eismann knew that Himmler could talk like this for hours. Kinzel, after a few minutes, took his leave because of pressing business. Eismann sat watching Himmler and Heinrici, mentally comparing them. He saw Heinrici, a persevering, greying old soldier, a serious, silent, taut little man for whom courtesy was a thing taken for granted, being subjected to the flamboyant ranting of an unsoldierly upstart who could not read the scale on a map. Looking at the wildly gesturing Himmler, repeating over and over the most unimportant facts in a theatrical tirade, he knew that Heinrici must be both shocked and disgusted. Eismann waited as long as he could. Then he too asked to be excused because there was much to do. A few minutes later, Heinrici noticed that the stenographer, unable to keep abreast of Himmler's verbal torrent, had put down his pencil. Heinrici, bored beyond belief, sat silently, letting the words flow over him. Suddenly the phone on Himmler's desk rang. Himmler picked it up and listened for a moment. He looked startled. He handed the phone to Heinrici. "You're the new commander," he said. "You'd better take this call." Heinrici picked up the phone. "Heinrici here. Who is this?" It was General Busse, commander of the Ninth Army. Heinrici froze as he listened. Disaster had already befallen his new command. The Russians had spotted Busse's preparations for the Kustrin attack. The 25th Panzer Division, one of Busse's best, which for months had held the corridor open between the Russian bridgeheads on either side of Kustrin, had been quietly pulling out of its positions in preparation for the offensive. Another division, the 20th Panzer, had been moving into the 25th's positions. The Russians had seen the exchange and attacked from the north and south. The pincers had snapped shut, just as Guderian had feared. The 20th Panzer Division was cut off, Kustrin was isolated, and the Russians now had a major bridgehead for the assault on Berlin. Heinrici cupped the phone and grimly told Himmler the news. The Reichsführer looked nervous and shrugged his shoulders. "Well," he said, "you are commander of Army Group Vistula." Heinrici stared. "Now look here," he said sharply. "I don't know a damn thing about the Army Group. I don't even know what soldiers I have or who's supposed to be where." Himmler looked blankly at Heinrici, and Heinrici saw that he could expect no help. He turned back to the phone and immediately authorized Busse to counterattack, at the same time promising the Ninth Army commander that he would get to the front as soon as possible. As he replaced the receiver, Himmler began his rambling discourse again, as though nothing had happened. But Heinrici was now thoroughly exasperated. Bluntly, he interrupted. It was necessary, he told Himmler, that he get the Reichsführer's considered opinion of the overall situation as far as Germany and her future were concerned. The question, he later remembered, was visibly disagreeable to Himmler. The Reichsführer rose from his chair, came around the desk, and, taking Heinrici's arm, ushered him across to a sofa on the far side of the room, out of earshot of the stenographer. Then, in a quiet voice, Himmler dropped a bombshell. "Through a neutral country," he confided, "I have taken the necessary steps to start negotiations with the West." He paused and added, "I'm telling you this in absolute confidence, you understand." There was a long silence. Himmler looked at Heinrici expectantly, presumably awaiting some comment. Heinrici was stunned. This was treason, betrayal of Germany, its armies, and its leaders. He struggled to control his thoughts. Was Himmler telling the truth? Or was it a ruse to trick him into an indiscretion? The ambitious Himmler, Heinrici believed, was capable of anything, even of treason in order to grab power for himself. The experienced frontline general sat speechless, revolted by Himmler's very presence. Suddenly the door opened and an SS officer appeared. Himmler seemed relieved at the interruption. "Herr Reichsführer," the officer announced, "the staff has assembled to say goodbye." Himmler rose and, without uttering another word, left the room. By 8 p.m., Himmler, his SS officers and bodyguard were gone. They took everything with them, including, as Balzen, Heinrici's Batman, soon discovered, the mansion's flatware, plates, even cups and saucers. Their departure was so complete that it was almost as though Himmler had never set foot inside the headquarters. Aboard his luxurious private train, Himmler headed swiftly into the night away from the Oder front toward the west. Behind him, he left a furious Heinrici. The new commander's anger and disgust mounted as he looked about his headquarters. One of his officers remembers that Heinrici's temper rose several degrees as he examined the effeminate decor of Himmler's mansion. The enormous office and everything in it was white. The bedroom was decorated in soft green, drapes, carpeting, upholstery, even the quilts and coverlets. Heinrici acidly remarked that the place was more appropriate for an elegant woman than a soldier trying to direct an army. Later that night, Heinrich telephoned his former chief of staff in Silesia, as he had promised, and told him what had occurred. He had regained control of his emotions and could think of the encounter more coolly. Himmler's disclosures, he had decided, were too fantastic to believe. Heinrich decided to forget about it. On the phone to his old colleague in Silesia, Heinrich said, "Himmler was only too happy to leave. He couldn't get out of here fast enough. He didn't want to be in charge when the collapse comes. No, he wanted just a simple general for that, and I'm the goat." In the room assigned to him, Heinrich's aide, Captain Heinrich von Bieler, paced restlessly up and down. He was unable to get his mind off the map he had seen at Guderian's headquarters at Zossen. It was odd, he thought, that no one had objected when he studied it, yet the map was obviously a confidential command document. Guderian must have shown it to him, but Heinrich had made no comment. Was it possible, therefore, that the map was less important than he believed? Maybe it had even been prepared at Guderian's headquarters, as a German estimate of Allied intentions. Still, von Bieler found that hard to accept. Why print it in English, not German? There was only one other explanation, that it was an Allied map, captured somehow by German intelligence. Where else could it have come from? If this was true, and von Bieler could think of no other answer, then somehow he had to warn his wife and 3 children. According to that map, if Germany was defeated, his home in Bernburg would lie in the zone controlled by the Russians. For unless von Bieler was imagining things, he had actually seen a top-secret plan showing how the Allies proposed to occupy and partition Germany. 50 miles away, the original of the map and its supporting papers lay in a safe at Auf dem Grat 1, Dahlem, Berlin, the emergency headquarters of Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations of OKW, Armed Forces High Command. And of all the fantastic secrets that had come into the hands of German intelligence during the war, this red-covered dossier was the most brutally revealing document Jodl had ever read. The file contained a letter and a 70-page background memorandum. Stitched into the back cover were 2 pull-out maps, each approximately 20 by 18 inches, and drawn to a scale of 1 inch to 29 miles. Jodl wondered if the Allies had yet discovered that a copy of the preamble to one of their top-secret war directives was missing. It had been captured from the British in late January, in the closing days of the Ardennes offensive. The Allied plan was considered so explosive by Hitler that only a few at OKW headquarters were permitted to see it. In the first week of February, the Führer, after spending one entire evening studying the dossier, classified the papers as state top secret. His military advisers and their staffs could study the plan, but no one else. Not even the members of his own cabinet were informed. But, despite these restrictions, one civilian saw the documents and maps. Frau Louisa Jodl, the general's bride of only a few weeks. One evening, just before their marriage, General Jodl decided to show the papers to his fiancée. She was, after all, the recipient of many military secrets. She had been a confidential secretary to the German High Command. Placing the entire file in his briefcase, General Jodl took it to her apartment, a block away from his headquarters. Almost as soon as the front door was safely closed behind him, he produced the papers and said to his fiancée, "That's what the Allies intend to do with Germany." Louise took the red-covered file over to a table and began looking through the pages. She had long ago learned to read military documents and maps, but in this instance that ability was hardly necessary. The papers were crystal clear. Her heart sank. What she held in her hands was the Allied blueprint for the occupation of the fatherland after Germany's defeat. Someone at Eisenhower's headquarters, she thought, had a vindictive bent in choosing code words. Across the cover of the file was the chilling title, Operation Eclipse. Jodl's actual headquarters translation of the original British copy of Operation Eclipse. This picture shows the covering letter, signed by Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Sir Francis de Guingand. It was on Jodl's desk less than 3 months after it had been circulated to only the highest officers of the Allied armies, and 1 month before it was even ratified at Yalta in February 1945. At left is the cover of one of Shaeff's copies of Eclipse. Note the date. Taking the dossier from her, General Jodl unfolded the maps and spread them flat on the table. "Look," he said bitterly, "look at the frontiers." In silence, Louise studied the heavy boundary lines drawn across the face of the map. The north and northwest area bore the inch-high initials UK. The southern Bavarian zone carried the letters USA. And the remainder of the Reich, roughly the entire central region, and from there due east, was labelled USSR. Even Berlin, she noted with dismay, was sliced up among the big three. Lying in the centre of the Russian zone, it was circled separately and trisected among the Allies. The Americans had the south, the British part of the north and all of the northwest, and the Soviets the northeast and east. So this was to be the price of defeat, she thought. Louise looked at her future husband. "It's like a nightmare," she said. Even though she knew the map must be genuine, Louise found the evidence difficult to accept. Where, she asked, had the eclipse file come from? Although she had known General Jodl for years, she knew that about some things he could be very close-mouthed. She had always thought Alfred withdrawn, hiding behind a mask, even from me. Now his answer was evasive. Although confirming that the maps and documents were genuine, he did not reveal how they were obtained, except to remark that, "We got them from a British headquarters." It was only much later, after Jodl had returned to his headquarters, that another fearful aspect of Operation Eclipse occurred to Louisa. If Germany was defeated, her relatives in the Harz Mountains would be living in the Russian-occupied zone. Although she loved Alfred Jodl and was completely loyal to her country, Louisa made a very human decision. On this occasion she would disregard his warnings never to reveal anything she saw, read, or heard. She could not allow her sister-in-law and 4 small children to fall into Russian hands. Louise decided to take a chance. She knew the general's priority telephone code number. Picking up the phone, she spoke to the operator and called her relatives. Within minutes, she got through. After a brief and innocuous conversation with her surprised sister-in-law, Louise casually remarked in closing, "You know the east wind is very strong these days. I really think you and the children should move west beyond the river." Slowly she put down the receiver, hoping that her clumsily coded message had been understood. At the other end of the line, her sister-in-law heard the click as the receiver was replaced. She wondered why Louise had called so late at night. It was good to hear from her, but she had no idea what Louise was talking about. She thought no more about it. The General and Louise were married on March 6th. Since then, Frau Jodl had worried that somehow her husband might find out about the call. She need not have been concerned. The overburdened general had more pressing problems. By now, Jodl and his staff officers had studied and analysed Operation Eclipse so thoroughly that they knew every paragraph almost by heart. Although it was not a strategic document, that is, it did not warn of imminent enemy moves that called for corresponding German countermoves, the Eclipse plan was almost as important. For one thing, it helped answer a series of questions that had bedevilled Jodl and the OKW for years. How strong, they had wondered, was the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union? Would it fall asunder when they sat down to divide the spoils? Now that Russian forces held most of Central Europe, did the unconditional surrender declaration made by Churchill and Roosevelt after the 1943 Casablanca Conference still stand? And did the Allies seriously intend to impose such terms on a defeated Germany? As Jodl and the German High Command studied the Eclipse file, all such questions about Allied intentions disappeared. The Allied document spelled out the answers in unmistakable terms. Not until the second week in February, however, did Jodl realise the full importance of the file, in particular of its maps. On February 9th, and for the next 3 days, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin met in secret conclave at Yalta. In spite of intelligence efforts to find out exactly what had transpired at the meeting, about all Jodl learned was contained in the official communiqué issued to the world's press on February 12th. But that was enough. Vague and guarded as the announcement was, It left no doubt that the eclipse papers and maps were the key to the announced Allied intentions. 1 paragraph in the official communiqué stated, "We have agreed on common policies and plans for enforcing the unconditional surrender terms which we shall impose together. These terms will not be made known until the final defeat of Germany. Under the agreed plan, the forces of the three powers will each occupy a separate zone of Germany." It was not necessary for the Allies to state the terms. Jodl had already read them in the eclipse file. Although the Yalta communiqué did not reveal the proposed zones of occupation, Jodl knew them as well. The position and precise boundaries of each zone were shown on the eclipse maps. There were many other conclusions that could be deduced, but one was particularly bitter for Jodl. It was clear that whatever else had occurred at Yalta, the Allied plans for Germany had merely been ratified at the meeting of the Big Three. While the Yalta communiqué gave the impression that the partitioning and occupation blueprint had originated at the meeting, the dates on the eclipse documents and maps proved beyond doubt that the basic decisions had been reached months before. The covering letter attached to the eclipse background memorandum was signed in January. The maps had been prepared before that. They had been printed in late 44 and carried a November date. Plainly, Operation Eclipse, which was defined as planning and operations for the occupation of Germany, could never have been produced at all unless there was complete unity among the Allies, a sobering fact that withered one of Germany's last hopes. From the moment the Red Army crossed the Reich's eastern frontiers, Hitler and his military advisers had waited for the first cracks of disunity to appear among the Allies. They believed it would surely happen because the West would never allow Soviet Russia to dominate Central Europe. Jodl shared these views. He was banking especially on the British, feeling that they would never tolerate such a situation. But that was before he set eyes on Operation Eclipse. Eclipse indicated clearly that the alliance was still intact, and Yalta had confirmed it. Beyond that, the very first paragraph of the covering letter, a foreword to the entire file, showed the complete agreement among the Allies. It read, "In order to carry out the surrender terms imposed on Germany, the governments of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, the latter also in the name of the Dominions, have agreed that Germany is to be occupied by the armed forces of the three powers." There was no disputing the authority of the letter. It had been signed in January 1945 at the British 21st Army Group headquarters, then in Belgium, by no less a personage than Major General Sir Francis de Guingand, Field Marshal Montgomery's Chief of Staff. The most crushing blow for Jodl was the repeated emphasis on unconditional surrender. It was mentioned again and again. From the beginning, the Germans had felt sure the unconditional surrender declaration had been intended as morale-building propaganda for the Allied home fronts. Now they knew better. The Allies had obviously meant every word of it. "The only possible answer to the trumpets of total war," Eclipse said, "is total defeat and total occupation. It must be made clear that the Germans will not be able to negotiate in our sense of that word." The Allied intent promised no hope, no future for Germany. It was clear that even if the Reich wished to capitulate, there was no way she could do so short of unconditional surrender. To Jodl, this meant that there was nothing left for Germany but to fight to the bitter end. It was during the last week of March, the exact day no one could later remember, that General Reinhard Gehlen, Guderian's chief of intelligence, drove to Prenzlau for a meeting with the new commander of Army Group Vistula. In his briefcase was a copy of Operation Eclipse. Gehlen outlined for Heinrici the latest known dispositions of the Russian troops on the Oder. Then he produced the Eclipse file and explained what it was. Heinrici slowly looked through the pages, pored over the maps, and studied them for a long time. Finally, Heinrici looked at Gehlen and, in one line, summarized what everyone in the High Command really knew the document to mean. "Das ist ein Todesurteil," this is a death sentence, he said. "Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula. Heinrici in his sheepskin coat. Heinrici today, with the author. Berlin. Heinrici's Chief of Staff, Major General von Trotha. General Max Pemsel, the fortifications expert who found Berlin's defences utterly futile." Major General Helmut Reimann, military commander of Berlin, examining an Italian rifle. Colonel Hans Reffior, right. Reimann's chief of staff. Frau Jodl, in 1945, as she is today. Colonel General Alfred Jodl and his wife on their wedding day, March 7th, 1945. Major General Reinhard Gehlen, Guderian's chief of intelligence, now head of the West Germany Intelligence Service. This is the only picture known to exist of him. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff in 1945. The mess we're in is fantastic. This photograph was taken in May 1940, when Guderian commanded the spearhead of the German panzer thrust to the Channel. General Walter Wenck, in whose hurriedly organised 12th Army Hitler placed his last hopes. He is shown in 1945 above, today. SS General Felix Steiner, commander of Group Steiner, photographed today, whose orders were to save Berlin and free the Führer. Colonel Theodor von Duffing in 1945 and today. Von Duffing was Chief of Staff to General Karl Weidling, commander of the 56th Panzer Corps, whom Hitler first ordered shot, then appointed Commandant of Berlin. Weidling and von Duffing surrendered the city to Chuikov on May 2, 1945. The Russian photograph below purports to show Weidling after the capitulation, but it is probably a posed shot, since the actual surrender took place in a house in Tempelhof rather than in a bunker. General Theodor Buss, commander of the 9th Army, at left in 1945. At right, today. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 3rd Panzer Army. We have an army of ghosts. Colonel Hans-Oskar Wohlemann, artillery commander, 56th Panzer Corps. Everywhere, he said, were soldiers, running away like madmen. Colonel Gunther Reichhelm, 12th Army Chief of Staff in 1945, and today. Lieutenant General Wolf Hagemann, 9th Army. Captain Helmuth Lang, shown standing behind Rommel, 1944, joined Heinrici in the closing hours of the war with a message of warning. The dream was gone. Willy Feldheim, who fought as a Hitler youth in Berlin. The top photograph shows him at the age of 15 in 1945. The middle photograph shows him after his release by the Russians from 2 years in a POW camp. The bottom photograph shows him today. The soldiers of the Berlin defence, aged between 12 and 15, photographed after capture. This picture was released to the author by the Russians. The Volkssturm Home Guard, some in their 70s. A rare view toward the Brandenburg Gate, showing one of the enormous camouflage canopies that were hung umbrella-like over various parts of the city as protection against air raid reconnaissance aircraft. The Tiergarten, littered with wreckage. In the background, the Reichstag. A few days later, on Palm Sunday, March 25th, Colonel General Jodl examined the eclipse maps again. He had good reason to do so. Units of General George S. Patton's U.S. Third Army had crossed the Rhine on Thursday night at the farming village of Oppenheim near Mainz, and were now heading for Frankfurt. The following day, in the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's forces swept across the river in a massive assault on a 25-mile front. Despite everything, the Rhine line was crumbling, and the Western Allies were driving fast. Now Jodl, anxiously re-examining the eclipse maps, wondered how deeply the Allies intended to drive into Germany. That was one question the eclipse background memorandum did not answer. Jodl wished he had the other sections of the plan, particularly the part covering military operations. Still, the maps provided a clue. He had even mentioned the matter to his wife. It was only a hunch, but Jodl thought he was right. The maps showed that the line of demarcation between the Anglo-Americans and the Russians ran roughly along the river Elbe from Lübeck to Wittenberge, and from there coiled south to the vicinity of Eisenach, then swung due east to the Czech border. Was that line, besides being a zonal boundary, also the terminating point of the Anglo-American advance? Jodl was nearly certain that it was. He told his wife he did not think the Americans and British were driving for Berlin. He believed they had decided to leave the capture of the capital to the Red Army. Unless the eclipse maps had been changed, it looked to Jodl as though Eisenhower's forces would grind to a halt on the eclipse boundary line. At his conference on January 27, 1945, Hitler asked Goering and Jodl, "Do you think that deep down inside the English are enthusiastic over all the Russian developments?" Jodl answered without hesitation. "Certainly not," he replied. "Their plans were quite different. Later, the full realization will come." Goering was also confident. "They certainly didn't plan that we hold them off while the Russians conquer all of Germany," he said. "They had not counted on us, holding them off in the west like madmen, while the Russians drive deeper and deeper into Germany." Jodl fully agreed, pointing out that the British have always regarded the Russians with suspicion. Goering was so certain that the British would attempt some sort of compromise with the Reich, rather than see the heart of Europe fall into the communist orbit, that he said, "If this goes on, we will get a telegram from the British in a few days." There may be some slight variations between this translation and the original document. When Eclipse was captured, it was translated into German and then photographed. The version given above is a translation of the captured document back into English. At Jodl's trial in Nuremberg in 1946, he was asked why he had not advised Hitler to capitulate early in 1945. Jodl said, "The reasons against it were primarily, and even if we had any doubt as to what faced us, it was completely removed by the fact that we captured the English Eclipse." At this point in his testimony, Jodl looked at the British officers present and said with a half smile, "The gentlemen of the British delegation will know what that is." The fact is that the remark was lost on the Britishers at the trial. Eclipse had been kept so secret that they knew nothing about it. It was this mysterious reference, plus several interviews with Frau Jodl, that led the author to Operation Eclipse and its contents, revealed here for the first time. A little before midnight on Palm Sunday, an American staff car pulled up outside the grey stone headquarters of the 82nd Airborne Division in Sisson, northern France. 2 officers got out. One was in American uniform, the other was dressed in British battle dress without insignia. The second man, tall and lanky, wore a neat green beret and, in vivid contrast to his blonde hair, sported a large, fierce-looking red moustache. To the British and Americans, his name was almost unpronounceable, Ari de Bestebrotje. He was widely known among them as Ari or Captain Harry. Even those names changed from mission to mission, for he spent most of his time behind German lines. Ari was a Special Forces agent and a member of the Dutch intelligence service. A few days before, Ari had been called to Brussels by his superiors and told that he was being assigned to the 82nd Division for a special operation. He was to report to the youthful 38-year-old Major General James M. Gavin, 82nd Division Commander, to take part in a top-secret briefing. Now Ari and his escorting officer entered the headquarters, hurried up a flight of stairs to the second floor, and down a corridor to a well-guarded map room. Here their credentials were checked by a military policeman, who then saluted and opened the door. Inside, Ari was warmly greeted by General Gavin and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Robert Wienicke. Most of the men in the room, Ari saw, were old friends. He had jumped and fought with them during the 82nd's assault on Nijmegen, Holland. His superiors in Brussels had not exaggerated the security measures he could expect. There were only 15 officers present, regimental commanders and certain members of their staffs, all clearly hand-picked. The room itself was quite plain. There were a few benches and tables, some charts on the walls. At one end of the room, a curtain covered a large, wall-sized map. Each man's name was now called out by a security officer who checked it off against a roster. Then General Gavin quickly opened the proceedings. Standing by the curtained map, he motioned everyone to gather around. "Only those of you with an absolute reason to know have been asked to this briefing," he began, "and I must emphasize that, until further orders, nothing you hear tonight is to go beyond this room. In a way, you will be training your men in the dark, for you will not be able to reveal to them the objective. Actually, you've already been giving them part of their training, although most of you were completely unaware of it. Over the last few weeks, you and your men have been jumping or flying onto a specific training area deliberately marked and laid out to simulate the actual dimensions of our next assault target. Gentlemen, we're going in for the kill. This is the Sunday punch." He yanked the cords at the side of the map. The curtains slid back, revealing the target. Berlin. Ari looked closely at the faces of the officers as they stared at the map. He thought he saw eagerness and anticipation. It did not surprise him. These commanders had been frustrated for months. Most of them had jumped with their units into Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Holland. But lately, the division had been relegated to ground actions, mainly in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. Ari knew that as crack airborne troops, they felt they had been denied their true role, assaulting objectives in front of the advancing armies and then holding on until relieved. The truth was that the Allied advance had been so fast that planned parachute drops had been cancelled again and again. The assault on Berlin, Gavin explained, would be part of a first Allied airborne army operation calling for units from 3 divisions. The 82nd, designated Task Force A, was to have the major role. Unrolling a transparent overlay from the top of the map, Gavin pointed to a series of squares and ovals marked in black grease pencil that outlined the various objectives and drop zones. "As plans now stand," he said, "the 101st Airborne Division will grab Gâteau Airfield, west of the city. A brigade from the British 1st Airborne Corps is to seize Oranienburg Airfield to the northwest." He paused and then continued. "Our piece of real estate is right in Berlin itself, Tempelhof Airport." The 82nd's target seemed incredibly small. In the sprawling 321 square miles of the city and its environs, the airport looked like a postage stamp, a smudge of green barely 1.5 miles square, lying in a heavily built-up area. On its north, east, and southern fringes there were, rather ominously, no less than 9 cemeteries. "2 regiments will hold the perimeters," Gavin said, "and the 3rd will move into the buildings north of the field, toward the centre of Berlin. We'll hang on to this airhead until the ground forces get to us. That should not be long, not more than a few days at the most." Blind training of the paratroopers, Gavin said, was to be intensified. Terrain models of Tempelhof and the surrounding areas would be set up in a secure room of the headquarters. Photographic coverage of the drop zone, intelligence appreciations, and other materials would be made available to the regimental commanders and their staffs for specific planning. "We are also lucky," said Gavin, "to have the services of Captain Harry. He is an expert on Berlin, particularly on Tempelhof and the surrounding region. He will be jumping with us, and from now on will be available for briefings and to answer all your questions." Gavin paused again and looked at his officers. "I'm sure all of you want to know the answer to the big question. How soon? That's up to the Germans. The airborne plan has been in the works since last November. There have been constant changes, and we must expect many more before we get a target date. A-Day, as that day has been designated, will depend on the speed of the Allied advance toward Berlin. Certainly the drop won't be scheduled until the ground forces are within a reasonable distance of the city, but A-Day may only be a matter of 2 or 3 weeks away, so we don't have much time. That's all I can tell you now." Gavin stepped back and turned the meeting over to his staff officers. One after the other, they went into each phase of the operation, and as they talked, Gavin sat half listening. As he later recalled, he regretted the fact that security had prevented him from revealing the details fully. He had been less than candid, for he had told his men only one part of the first Allied airborne operation, the operational section calling for the assault in conjunction with the Allied drive to capture Berlin. What he had not mentioned was that the same airborne drop might be ordered under a different military condition, the sudden collapse or surrender of Germany and her armed forces. But that part of the plan was still top secret. It was the logical extension to Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe, and for a time had been known as Operation Rankin, Case C, and later as Operation Talisman. That last title had been changed in November 1944 for security reasons. Now it bore the code name Operation Eclipse. Eclipse was so secret that apart from high-ranking staff officers at Supreme Headquarters, only a score of generals had been permitted to study it. They were Army or Corps commanders, or those in the other services with equivalent responsibilities. Few division commanders knew anything about Eclipse. Gavin had learned only some of the plan's objectives, and those parts of it that specifically concerned him and his division. During the previous months, at numerous conferences attended by General Lewis H. Brereton, commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, and Gavin's immediate superior, Major General Matthew B. Ridgway, commander of the 18th Corps Eclipse, had been referred to as the occupation plan for Germany. It detailed the operational moves that would immediately take place in the event of a German surrender or collapse. Its main objectives were the enforcement of unconditional surrender and the disarmament and control of all German forces. Under Eclipse conditions, the airborne assault plan on Berlin called for the paratroopers to move swiftly, to gain control over the enemy's capital and foremost administrative and transportation centre, and display our armed strength. They were to subdue any remaining pockets of fanatics who might continue to resist, rescue and care for prisoners of war, seize top-secret documents, files and films before they could be destroyed. Control information centres such as postal and telecommunications offices, radio stations, newspaper and printing plants. Capture war criminals and surviving principles of the government and establish law and order. The airborne troops were to initiate all these moves pending the arrival of land forces and military government teams. That was as much as Gavin had been told about Operation Eclipse. As to what the plan contained regarding the manner in which Germany or Berlin was to be occupied or zoned after the defeat, he had no knowledge. Right now, Gavin's only concern was to prepare the 82nd. But as a result of all the requirements, this meant the preparation of two distinct plans. The first was the operational assault to capture the city. The second, as conceived under Eclipse conditions, called for airborne units to drop on Berlin as an advance guard, but charged with a police action only. Gavin had told his commanders all he dared, even though he knew that if the war were to end suddenly, the entire airborne mission would change dramatically. As things stood, his orders were explicit. He was to follow the operational plan and get the 82nd ready for an airborne assault to capture Berlin. Gavin was suddenly aware that the Dutch intelligence officer was concluding his part of the briefing. "I must repeat that if you are expecting help from anyone in Berlin, forget it," Captain Harry was saying. "Will you find guides willing to help? Answer, no. Is there an underground such as we had in France and Holland? Answer, no. Even if some Berliners are privately sympathetic, they will be too frightened to show it. We can discuss all these matters in greater detail later. But right now, let me assure you of this. Do not have any illusions that you will be greeted as liberators with champagne and roses. The army, the SS, and the police will fight until the last bullet, and then they will come out with their hands in the air, tell you that the whole thing was really a dreadful mistake, that it was all Hitler's fault, and thank you for getting to the city before the Russians." The big Dutchman tugged at his moustache. "But they are going to fight like blazes," he said. "And it may be a bit sticky for a time. It will be worth it, and I'm proud to be going with you. My friends, when we take Berlin, the war is over." Taking Berlin would not be easy, Gavin knew, but he thought that the psychological shock of the assault might in itself overwhelm the German defenders. It would be one of the war's biggest airborne attacks. In the initial planning, the operation called for 3,000 protective fighters, 1,500 transport planes, probably more than 1,000 gliders, and some 20,000 paratroopers, more than had been dropped in Normandy on D-Day. "All we need now," Gavin told his officers as the meeting broke up, "is a decision and the word go." 30 miles away, at Mourmelon-le-Grand, the tough 101st Airborne Division was also in training and stood ready for any operation. But nobody in the 101st knew which one would be ordered. So many paratroop assault plans had come down the pipe from higher headquarters that the commander, Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, his assistant, Brigadier General Gerald J. Higgins, and the staff found themselves in a quandary. They had to prepare for all of them, but seriously wondered if any of the projected drops would ever take place. Besides the Berlin project, there were plans for an airborne attack on the German naval base at Kiel, Operation Eruption, for a series of drops on prisoner of war camps, Operation Jubilon, and for an assault to seize objectives ahead of the US 7th Army as it drove toward the Black Forest, Operation Effective. Many others were under study, and some were quite fantastic. The 101st Headquarters had learned that the staff of the 1st Allied Airborne Army was even considering a jump on the mountains around Berchtesgaden in Bavaria to seize the Eagle's Nest on the Obersalzberg, and perhaps its owner, Adolf Hitler. Obviously, not all the drops could be scheduled. As General Higgins told the staff, "There just aren't that many transport planes to accommodate the airborne demands if all these operations are ordered. Anyway, we're not greedy, all we want is one." But which operation would the airborne army get, and in particular, what would be the role of the 101st? The Berlin drop seemed the most likely, even though the operations chief, Colonel Harry Kinnard, thought it would be quite a hairy bit of business. Everyone was bitter that in the event of a Berlin drop, the men of the 101st had drawn Gatow Airfield, while their arch-rivals, the 82nd, had been given the primary objective, Tempelhof. Still, Berlin was the biggest target of the war. There was enough for everyone. To Colonel Kinnard, an airborne drop seemed the perfect way to end the war in Europe. On the war room map, he had even drawn a red line from the staging areas in France to the 101st's drop zones in Berlin. The German capital was only 475 air miles away. If they got the green light, he thought the first Americans could be in Berlin in just about 5 hours. General Taylor, the 101st's commander, and his assistant, General Higgins, while eager for the attack, wondered if the airborne would even get the chance. Higgins morosely studied the map. "The way the ground forces are moving," he said, "they're going to put us out of business." On this same day, Sunday, March 25th, the military leaders of the Western Allies received gratifying news from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. In Washington and London, General George C. Marshall, U.S. Chief of Staff, and Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, studied a cable from General Dwight D. Eisenhower that had arrived the night before. The recent series of victories west of the Rhine has resulted as planned in the destruction of a large proportion of available enemy forces on the Western Front. While not desiring to appear over-optimistic, it is my conviction that the situation today presents opportunities for which we have struggled and which must be seized boldly. It is my personal belief that the enemy strength is becoming so stretched that penetrations and advances will soon be limited only by our maintenance. I am directing the most vigorous actions on all fronts. I intend to reinforce every success with utmost speed. The lines of men and vehicles seemed endless. Peering out of his unarmed Piper Cub, the scouting plane Miss Me, Lieutenant Duane Francis gazed down, fascinated by the spectacle below. The landscape swarmed with troops, tanks, and vehicles. Ever since late March, when the last of the armies crossed the Rhine, Francis had watched the breakout develop. Now the great river was far behind, and off to the right and left, and stretching ahead as far as Francis could see, was a vast khaki panorama. Francis pushed the stick forward, and Miss Me swooped down along the boundary of the British 2nd and US 9th Armies. He waggled the wings, saw the answering waves of the troops, and headed due east to take up his task as the eyes of the leading tank columns of the 5th Armoured Division. Victory was near, of that he was sure. Nothing could stop this advance. It seemed to the 24-year-old pilot, he later recalled, that the very crust of the earth itself had shaken loose and was rushing like hell for the Elbe, the last major water barrier before Berlin. What Francis saw was only a minuscule part of the great Allied assault. For days now, in biting cold, in driving rain and through mud, in sleet and over ice, all along the Western Front from Holland almost to the Swiss border, a 350-mile-wide torrent of men, supplies and machines had been flooding into the German plains. The last great offensive was on. To destroy the German military might, 7 powerful armies, 85 huge divisions, 5 of them airborne and 23 armoured, the bulk of the immense Western Allied force of 4,600,000 men, were swarming into the Reich for the kill. Makeshift flags of surrender, white sheets, towels, scraps of cloth, hung everywhere. In the towns and villages, frightened Germans, still dazed by the battles that had washed over them, stared in amazement from doorways and shattered windows at the vast strength of the Allies that flowed all about them. The operation was gigantic, its speed breathtaking. Hammering down every road were convoys of tanks, self-propelled guns, heavy artillery, armoured cars, Bren gun carriers, ammunition conveyors, ambulances, gasoline trucks, and huge diesel transporters towing block-long trailers loaded with equipment, bridging sections, pontoons, armoured bulldozers, and even landing craft. Division headquarters were on the move, with their jeeps, staff cars, command caravans, and massive radio trucks sprouting forests of trembling antennae. And in wave after wave, choking every road, were the troops. In trucks and on the backs of armoured vehicles, marching by the sides of the motorised columns or slogging through the adjoining fields. They formed a violent, gaudy parade, and in their midst were battle flags, regimental badges, and insignia that had made history in World War II. In the divisions, brigades, and regiments were guardsmen who had fought the rearguard action during the evacuation of Dunkirk, bearded commandos in faded green berets, veterans of Lord Lovat's brigade who had raided the coasts of occupied Europe in the darkest years of the war, tough Canadians of the famous 2nd Division who had landed at Dieppe in the bloody rehearsal for the Normandy invasion. In the armoured columns, pennants fluttering, were a few of the original desert rats of the 7th Armoured Division who had helped run Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to ground in the Libyan sands. And riding high above the tremendous din of men and arms was the skirling music of the Devils in Skirts, the 51st Highland Division, their pipes sounding the prelude to battle as they had always done. In the phalanxes of Americans were divisions with impudent names and colourful legends. The Fighting 69th, the 5th Armoured Victory Division, the Rail Splitters of the 84th Infantry, the 4th Infantry Ivy Division. There was the 2nd Armoured, Hell on Wheels, whose unconventional tank tactics had caused havoc for the Germans all the way from the wadis of North Africa to the banks of the Rhine. There was the 1st Division, the Big Red One, with a record of more assault landings than any other American unit. The 1st, together with one of the oldest US forces, the tough, tradition-steeped 29th Blue and Grey Division, had hung on when all seemed lost to a narrow strip of Normandy beach called Omaha. One unit, the illustrious 83rd Infantry Division, which was moving as fast as an armoured task force, had recently been nicknamed the Ragtag Circus by the correspondents. Its resourceful commander, Major General Robert C. Macon, had given orders to supplement the division's transport with anything that moved. No questions asked. Now the Ragtag Circus was going flat out in a weird assortment of hurriedly repainted captured German vehicles, Wehrmacht jeeps, staff cars, ammunition trucks, Mark V and Tiger Panzers, motorbikes, buses, and 2 cherished fire engines. Out in front, with infantrymen hanging all over it, was one of the fire trucks. On its rear bumper was a large flapping banner. It read, "Next stop, Berlin." There were 3 great army groups. Between Nijmegen in Holland and Dusseldorf on the Rhine, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery's 21st Army Group had erupted across the Rhine on March 23rd and was now racing across the Westphalian plains, north of the great Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial mainspring. Under Montgomery's command, and holding his northern flank, was the Canadian First Army under Lieutenant General Henry D. Crerar. In the centre was Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey's British Second Army, the most allied of all the Allied armies. The second had, besides British, Scottish and Irish units, contingents of Poles, Dutch, Belgians, Czechs, and even a US division, the 17th Airborne. Driving along the Army Group's southern flank was Montgomery's Third Force, Lieutenant General William H. Simpson's powerful US 9th Army. Already Montgomery's forces had left the Rhine almost 50 miles behind. Next in the Allied line, holding a front of about 125 miles along the Rhine from Dusseldorf to the Mainz area, was the 12th Army Group under the quiet, unassuming General Omar N. Bradley. Like Montgomery, Bradley had 3 armies. However, one of them, the US 15th under Lieutenant General Leonard Gero, was a ghost army. It was being prepared for occupation duties, and for the moment was playing a relatively non-active role, holding the western bank of the Rhine, directly in front of the Ruhr, from the Dusseldorf area to Bonn. Bradley's strength lay with the powerful US First and Third Armies, a force totaling close to 500,000 men. General Courtney Hodges' US First Army, the workhorse of the European theatre and the army that had led the Normandy invasion, was surging south of the Ruhr, charging east at a breakneck pace. Ever since the capture of the Remagen Bridge on March 7th, Hodges had steadily enlarged the bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank. Division after division packed into it. Then, on March 25th, the men of the 1st had burst out of the lodgment with incredible force. Now, 3 days later, they were more than 40 miles from their jump-off point. Storming across central Germany next to the First Army was General George S. Patton's famous US Third Army. The controversial and explosive Patton, whose boast was that his Third Army had travelled farther and faster, liberated more square miles of the continent, and killed and captured more Germans than any other, racked up another first. He had stolen Montgomery's thunder by secretly crossing the Rhine on the run more than 24 hours before the 21st Army Group's much-publicized assault on March 23rd. Now Patton's tank columns were advancing eastward at the rate of 30 miles a day. Next to Patton, and on the right flank of General Bradley's command, was the third great Allied ground force, General Jacob Devers' 6th Army Group. Devers' 2 armies, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch's US 7th and General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny's French 1st, held the front's southern wing for roughly 150 miles. The armies of Patch and Patton were driving almost abreast of each other. De Tassigny's army was fighting over some of the most rugged terrain on the entire front, through the mountainous Vosges and Black Forest. His force, the first post-liberation French army, had not existed 6 months before. Now its 100,000 soldiers hoped there was still time before the war ended to settle accounts with les Boches. Everyone had a score to settle. But along the Western Front, the German army scarcely existed any longer as a cohesive, organized force. Decimated during the Ardennes offensive, the Reich's once powerful armies had been finally smashed in the month-long campaign between the Moselle and the Rhine. Hitler's decision to fight west of the Rhine rather than withdraw his battered forces to prepared positions on the eastern banks had proved disastrous. It would be recorded as one of the greatest military blunders of the war. Nearly 300,000 men had been taken prisoner and 60,000 were killed or wounded. In all, the Germans lost the equivalent of more than 20 full divisions. Now it was estimated that although more than 60 German divisions remained, they were merely paper divisions, with only 5,000 men apiece instead of the full-strength complement of 9,000 to 12,000 each. In fact, it was believed that there were barely 26 complete divisions left in the West, and even these were ill-equipped, lacking ammunition, drastically short of fuel and transport, artillery and tanks. In addition, there were the shattered remnants of divisions, splintered SS groups, anti-aircraft gun troops, thousands of Luftwaffe men — the German Air Force had almost disappeared — quasi-military organizations, Home Guard Volkssturm units composed of untrained old men and boys, and even cadres of teenage officer cadets. Disorganized, lacking communications, and often without competent leaders, the German army was unable to stop or even slow up the systematic onslaught of Eisenhower's armies. With the offensive from the Rhine barely a week old, the racing armies from Montgomery's and Bradley's groups were already closing in on the last German stronghold, the heavily defended Ruhr. Simultaneous with the developing drive eastward, 3 US armies had suddenly and abruptly wheeled to take on the envelopment of the Ruhr from north and south. On the north, Simpson's 9th Army changed direction from due east and was beginning to march southeast. To the south, Hodges's 1st and Patton's 3rd armies, moving parallel, with Patton on the outside, were also turning and heading northeast for a link-up with Simpson. The trap had been sprung so quickly that the Germans, principally Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, a force of no less than 21 divisions, seemed almost unaware of the pincers closing around them. Now they were threatened with encirclement, caught up in a pocket some 70 miles long and 55 miles wide, a pocket that Allied intelligence said contained more men and equipment than the Russians had captured at Stalingrad. In the overall plan to defeat Germany, the crossing of the Rhine and the capture of the Ruhr had always been considered essential and formidable objectives. The sprawling industrial Ruhr basin, with its coal mines, oil refineries, steel mills, and armament factories, covered almost 4,000 square miles. It had been thought that its capture might take months, but that was before the German debacle on the Rhine. Now the pincer manoeuvre, the stratagem of the quiet Missourian Omar Bradley, was being executed at breathtaking pace. The Americans were moving so fast that division commanders now talked of completing the encirclement in a matter of days. Once the Ruhr was sealed, Germany would have little strength left to impede the progress of the great Allied offensive. Even now, the enemy was so disrupted that there was no continuous defence line. The German forces were so disorganised that Major General Isaac D. White, commanding the U.S. 2nd Armoured Division, ordered his men to bypass any major resistance and keep on going. The 2nd, spearheading the 9th Army's pincer movement along the northern rim of the Ruhr, had dashed more than 50 miles in just under 3 days. The Germans fought hard in isolated pockets, but the 2nd encountered more trouble from blown bridges, hurriedly erected roadblocks, minefields, and bad terrain than from enemy action. It was the same nearly everywhere. Lieutenant Colonel Wheeler G. Merriam, leading the 2nd's dash with his 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion, encountered a great deal of confusion and very little fighting. On March 28th, with his tanks spread out on either side of a main railway line running east and west, Merriam called a halt to report his new position. As his radio man tried to raise headquarters, Merriam thought he heard a steam whistle. Suddenly, a German train, filled with troops and hauling flat cars loaded with armoured vehicles and guns, puffed along the line, passing right through his units. Germans and Americans gazed at each other in amazement. Merriam, looking up at the Wehrmacht soldiers leaning out of the train windows, was so close that he distinctly noted the individual hairs on men's faces where they hadn't shaved. His men, flabbergasted, gazed after the train as it headed west. Not a single shot was fired by either side. At last, galvanized into action, Merriam grabbed the radio telephone. Some miles to the west, the division commander, Major General White, saw the train come into sight almost at the same time that he heard Merriam's excited warning on his Jeep radio. White saw an MP, directing the columns, suddenly halt the traffic that was moving across the tracks, and then White, like Merriam, stood mesmerized as the train rolled by. Seconds later, field telephone in hand, White was calling for artillery fire. Within minutes, the 92nd Field Artillery, set up farther west, let loose a salvo that cut the train cleanly in two. Later it was discovered that the flat cars carried numerous anti-tank guns, field pieces, and a 16-inch railway gun. Captured soldiers who had been on the train said that they had been completely ignorant of the Allied advance. They had thought the Americans and British were still west of the Rhine. Confusion was both an ally and a foe. Lieutenant Colonel Ellis W. Williamson of the 30th Infantry Division was moving so fast that he was even fired on by the artillerymen of another Allied division, who thought Williamson's men were Germans retreating to the east. Lieutenant Clarence Nelson of the 5th Armoured had an equally bizarre experience. His jeep was shot out from under him, and Nelson jumped into a half-track, which came under heavy fire. He ordered a tank to wipe out the enemy strongpoint. It moved out, breasted a hill, and fired 2 rounds into a British armoured car. The occupants were irate but unhurt. They had been lying in wait hoping to find a target of their own, and Chaplain Ben L. Rose of the 113th Mechanized Cavalry remembers a tank commander reporting solemnly to the group leader, "We advanced the last 100 yards, sir, under grass. Resistance is heavy, both enemy and friendly. So rapid were the manoeuvres, and so fast were the German defences crumbling, that many commanders worried more about fatalities from road accidents than from enemy fire. Captain Charles King of the famed British 7th Armoured Division begged his men to be careful driving on these roads. It would be a pity, he warned, to die in an accident just now. A few hours later, King, one of the original desert rats, was dead. His jeep had hit a German landmine. Most men had no idea where they were or who was on their flanks. Forward units, in many instances, were already running off their maps. The resourceful scouts of the 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion were not in the least concerned. They were using emergency charts, silken handkerchief-size US Air Force escape maps supplied to all combat flyers earlier in the war to help them slip out of enemy territory if they were shot down. The 82nd Scouts confirmed their positions simply by checking with German signposts. In the 84th Division sector, Lieutenant Colonel Norman D. Carnes discovered that in his whole battalion there were only 2 maps left showing proposed advances. He was not worried either, not so long as his radios worked and he could keep in touch with headquarters. Lieutenant Arthur T. Hadley, a psychological warfare expert attached to the 2nd Armoured Division, who used a loudspeaker on his tank instead of a gun to demand the surrender of German towns, was now using the maps in an ancient Baedeker guide intended for tourists. Captain Francis Schommer of the 83rd Division always knew where he had led his battalion. He just grabbed the first German he saw, stuck a gun in his ribs, and in fluent German demanded to know where he was. He hadn't had a wrong answer yet. To the men of the armoured divisions, the advance from the Rhine was their kind of warfare. The snaking lines of armour that now thrust, bypassed, encircled and carved through the German towns and armies were offering a classic example of armoured tactics at their best. Some men tried to describe in letters the great armoured race to the east. Lieutenant Colonel Clifton Batchelder, commander of the 1st Battalion, 67th Armoured Regiment, thought that the drive had all the dash and daring of the great cavalry operations of the Civil War. Lieutenant Gerald P. Liebman, noting that as the 5th Armoured Division cut through the enemy, thousands of Germans were left behind, fighting in isolated pockets, wrote tongue-in-cheek that "We are exploiting the enemy's rear areas after breaching his frontal positions." To Liebman, the attack was reminiscent of General Patton's armoured dash out of the Normandy hedgerows, in which he had also participated. "No one eats or sleeps," he noted. "All we do is attack and push on, attack and push on. It is France all over again. Except this time the flags flying from the houses are not French tricolours, but flags of surrender." In the Devonshire Regiment racing along with the British 7th Armoured Division, Lieutenant Frank Barnes told his friend Lieutenant Robert Davey that "it is wonderful to be going forward all the time." Both men were elated, for at the briefing before the attack, they had been told that this was the last great push and that the ultimate objective was Berlin. Field Marshal Montgomery had always known that Berlin was the ultimate objective. Quick to anger, impatient of delays, temperamental and often tactless, but always both realistic and courageous, Montgomery had fixed his sights on Berlin as far back as his great victory in the desert at El Alamein. The one man who had unreservedly said "go" when weather might have delayed the invasion of Normandy, he now demanded the green light again. In the absence of any clear-cut decision from the Supreme Commander, Montgomery had announced his own. At 6:10 p.m. on Tuesday, March 27th, in a coded message to Supreme Headquarters, he informed General Eisenhower, "Today I issued orders to Army commanders for the operations eastwards, which are now about to begin. My intention is to drive hard for the line of the Elbe using the 9th and 2nd Armies. The right of the 9th Army will be directed on Magdeburg and the left of the 2nd Army on Hamburg. The Canadian Army will operate to clear northeast Holland and West Holland and the coastal area to the north of the left boundary of the 2nd Army. I have ordered 9th and 2nd Armies to move their armoured and mobile forces forward at once to get through to the Elbe with utmost speed and drive. The situation looks good, and events should begin to move rapidly in a few days. My tactical headquarters moved northwest of Bonninghart on Thursday, March 29th. Thereafter, my headquarters will move to Wesel, Münster, Wiedenbrück, Herford, Hanover, then by Autobahn to Berlin, I hope. Turning slowly in mid-air on the end of their ropes, Aunt Effie and Uncle Otto gazed mournfully down on the rubble-filled Berlin courtyard. From the back balcony of his second-story Wilmersdorf flat, Karl Weiberg spoke softly and encouragingly to the Dachshunds as he pulled them up to safety. He was putting them through the air raid escape procedure he had devised, and the dogs, after weeks of training, were now well conditioned. So were Weiberg's neighbours, although they thought that the Swede's concern for his pets was excessive. Everyone had grown accustomed to the sight of Aunt Effie and Uncle Otto, coats brushed and gleaming, going up and down past the windows. No one paid much attention to the dangling ropes either, which was exactly the way Weiberg wanted it. One day, if the Gestapo ever closed in, he might have to go over the back balcony and make his getaway down the same ropes. He had thought out everything very carefully. A single slip could mean his exposure as an Allied spy, and now, with Berliners growing daily more suspicious and anxious, Weiberg was taking no chances. He had still not discovered Hitler's whereabouts. His casual and innocent-seeming questions apparently evoked no suspicion, but they turned up no information either. Even his high-ranking friends in the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe knew nothing. Weiberg was beginning to believe that the Führer and his court were not in Berlin. Suddenly, as he lifted the dogs onto the balcony, the doorbell rang. Weiberg tensed. He was not expecting visitors, and he lived with a gnawing fear that one time he would go to the door and find the police. He carefully freed the dogs and then went to the door. Outside stood a stranger. He was tall and husky, dressed in working clothes and a leather jacket. Balanced on his right shoulder was a large carton. "Karl Weiberg?" he asked. Weiberg nodded. The stranger dumped the carton inside the door. "A little present from your friends in Sweden," he said with a smile. "My friends in Sweden?" said Weiberg warily. "Oh, you know damned well what it is," said the stranger. He turned and went quickly down the stairs. Weiberg softly closed the door. He stood frozen, looking down at the carton. The only presents he got from Sweden were supplies for the Berlin espionage operation. Was this a trap? Would the police come bursting into the apartment the moment he opened the box? Quickly he crossed the living room and looked cautiously down into the street. It was empty. There was no sign of his visitor. Weiberg returned to the door and stood for some time listening. He heard nothing out of the ordinary. At last he lugged the carton onto the living room sofa and opened it. The box which had been so casually delivered contained a large radio transmitter. Weiberg suddenly discovered he was sweating. Some weeks before, Weiberg had been notified by his superior, a Dane named Hennings Jessen Schmidt, that henceforth he was to be storekeeper for the spy network in Berlin. Ever since, he had been receiving a variety of supplies through couriers, but up to now he had always been warned beforehand, and the actual deliveries had always been handled with extreme caution. His phone would ring twice, then stop. That was the signal that a delivery was to be made. The supplies arrived only during the hours of darkness, and generally during an air raid. Never before had Weiberg been approached in broad daylight. He was furious. Somebody, he was later to put it, had acted in a very naive and amateurish way, and seemed bent on wrecking the entire operation. Weiberg's position had become increasingly dangerous. He could not afford a visit from the police, for his apartment was now a virtual warehouse of espionage equipment,